week for us. You know, because you came to this event through our website, Sinosphere.com, that we've had a series of events Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and today's is the concluding event. We've been really grateful to work with the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art in Salt Lake City. They've mounted a exhibition, a retrospective exhibition of the work of our colleague in the humanities program, senior artist in residence, Alex Caldiero. It's called Baggage. And if you go see the exhibition, and you should, it's an extraordinary exhibition. There's some baggage on the floor. And then there's a collection of work that Alex has done over 50 years that gives you a sense for an extraordinary and creative mind at work in all kinds of media. I'd like to thank the College of Humanities and Social Science for their support for this week's symposium, the Department of Philosophy and Humanities for their support. Kim Abunawara is the director of our humanities program. She led a student panel yesterday discussing work of Alex. It didn't feel to me like a student panel at all. It felt to me like three very intelligent people reading and interpreting and talking about Alex's work. It's really wonderful when that barrier between students and professors disappear, and we find ourselves working in interesting ways on joint projects. I think that is what I want to say to the beginning, but now I want to welcome the two guests for today's conversation, Alex Caldiero and Tyler Chadwick. I'd suggest that you look at the website, thesinosphere.com, for additional information about Alex Caldiero. His vita is there and his works are there. I just want to say that Alex has been my dear friend for 3 decades, and my life is richer and fuller because of my connections and interconnections with him over these years. Tyler Chadwick is an award-winning writer, editor, and teacher. He's in the English department at UVU. He has 3 books to his name. 2 of them are anthologies, Fire in the Pasture, 21st Century Mormon Poets, and Dove Song, Heavenly Mother in Mormon Poetry. And if I'm not mistaken, Tyler, you've gathered some of Alex's work in both of those.
Yep, he's in both of them.
Collections. He also has a book of poetry and essays called Field Notes on Language and Kinship. We'll be talking some about his dissertation today, and you can read the whole dissertation. I did last night and this morning. It's in a link on our site under reviews. There are a couple of other things by Tyler there as well. So I suggest you take a look at that. Tyler and Alex, I'm going to let you start. I'll be here, but I'm going to unplug my phone so that I don't get messages during the thing. So there we go.
Hey, Tyler, so good to see you.
Good to see you too.
And to talk to you especially, you know, and I think, as I told you before, there was always something that I found curious. So I can't remember the exact day or year, but one of my students at the time, and I believe it was Travis,
Mm-hmm.
you know, who told me, Travis Lowe, who told me that that there was an abstract online. You know, somebody is doing a book on you, their dissertation. And so I said, you should take a look at it. Well, I went in. The first thing that struck me was that it was about 64 pages. You know, and I go, who is this guy? So I ran through it and I saw what you had done already in terms of research, and we had never met. You know, and I go, number one, why is he doing this? And number two, how come he hasn't talked to me? You know, I mean, number three, though, in really mulling over what you had written and what you were outlining, was a very interesting thought that came to my head about my own work that I had never thought of before, and how there was a certain independence of it from me, that it was speaking for itself. Whatever I had done was out there, and without me, perfectly fine, perfectly developed, the ideas were clear, and so that for the first time, I felt like, I go, well, if I die, I can be resuscitated. My ideas have some sort of coherence independent of me, because I've always felt such a deep connection to it. Like with a kid, you always have to feel like your son or your daughter, but you always have to make sure you're there for them, if something goes wrong, or to watch over them. And for the first time, I felt that I didn't have to do that. And that was both disturbing and enlightening.
Yeah.
And the thing that I was asking myself is, how did he do that? What kind of research method, or the how, as well as the why, kept bugging me, and they still do to this day. Why did he do that? Because I could see, I go, this is a tremendous effort, and he doesn't know me, or he does, but he doesn't. So I was wondering if you could take this opportunity to sort of give me some feedback on that, of the why and the how.
The why and the how.
Yeah, especially the how. So how did you approach this material so that you can draw from it what I thought was not only valid, but enlightening to me?
Yeah.
It sort of made me understand myself. Now I say that's kind of an accomplishment, and not an easy one. So would you say something about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say that it really, it touches me, it moves me to hear you say that, because all along through this whole process, the primary thing in my mind was, how is Alex receiving this? Like, how is this conversing with him and his life and his intentions? And to know that it added something to you, that means I tried. Well, I did what I set out to do, and what I continue to set out to do as I continue engaging with your work. So I'm really appreciative to hear that, and that moves me, actually, to know that my work moved you like your work has moved me. Now the why I approached it was, in part, it started with when I was gathering the work for Fire in the Pasture. I was trying to gather as many poets who tied themselves to the Mormon tradition as I could. And I found your work online. I think the first thing I encountered from you was Various Atmospheres, published by Signature Books in the late 90s. And I saw that, and as I was gathering names, I put you on my list, and I kind of moved on. And then later that year, I encountered for the first time your bite-sized poetry contribution to Catherine Cole's Poet Laureate project. The beautiful, idyllic, isn't it? And just the explosive nature of that performance, I'm not gonna lie, the first time I saw it, it really set me on my heels. And I was like, what the hell is going on here? And it kind of freaked me out for a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. Then in that next spring, I was finishing up my coursework for my PhD, and I took a class called How to Read an Oral Poem. And this kind of gets at the how that you asked me, how I approached your work. Because I was so shocked by that first performance that I saw from you on YouTube, it stuck in my mind. And there were things that I started learning in that class about how to approach oral poetries, how to think about them differently than we do poetry on the page. There were principles and things that I was learning there that kind of stirred me to turn back to your work and to start trying to tease out what was going on. So it started with shock and then kind of moved into this fascination with what is this guy doing? And trying to apply those tools, things like looking at what you're doing in your performance, what your body is doing, how the sound is emanating from you, how you're interacting with the audience, all of those little things, your intonation, all of that, trying to pull that together and think about it, and then to contextualize it, to look at, okay, where does this guy come from? Thinking about your beginnings in Sicily and these different figures that you've put yourself into conversation with, like you say, the Kunta story, the mocker, which you pointed to yesterday, the poet, the shaman, all of these different figures. I started thinking about you in conversation with them and looking at everything you'd said about your work. I started collecting your written works, looking through as many performances as I could online until our first meeting, which was at the end of, I think, 2000 or the beginning of 2012 when we first met. And I was doing the reading for my dissertation or for my doctoral exams. And so I'd been tinkering around with a lot of stuff. So, so the why is because you shocked me, first of all, and then I found something fascinating in your work. And the how was trying to pull from outside of everything that I had learned in my literature classes and to think about the text contextually, and to look at what you're doing as you're up there performing. And I want to add one thing before I throw it back to you or to Scott. At our first face-to-face interaction, it was at the end of a conference presentation where I was talking about your work, thinking about it in terms of ethnography. And I showed a performance where the Poetarian performance, where you were in a big box and you asked people to bring a ticket up to you, and you would give them a text in return, a Sicilian proverb, something in English. And a little girl would come up and you opened the curtains in the shack and you had your burqa on and you looked at her and she looked at you with wide eyes and then turned tail and ran back to her parents. So I talked about that a little bit. But after the performance, or after my presentation, you came up to me and you opened your arms and you pulled me into an embrace and you whispered in my ear, "Thank you, Tyler." And then you kind of stepped back and said, "See, I'm not that scary." And then there was a pause and you said, "Am I?" But I want to read just a slight thing that I wrote in my dissertation about this interaction, because it springboarded me to see that there was a different level to your work than I had been considering. So here's this from the beginning of one of the chapters. "The sensuous immediacy of Alex's embrace lingered with me after we parted ways that day, because he welcomed me into such proximity with his first act in our first face-to-face encounter, and because the language he offered in that moment seemed to emerge from a genuine desire to connect with and be understood by another person, I sensed that his poiesis included a moral dimension I had not yet considered. So there were moments like this along the way where being in your presence, talking to you, kind of visiting your classes and sitting with you and conversing with you, they not only added insight into what I was writing and thinking about, in some moments, they turned my attention to the moral aspects of what you're doing. And they shaped and they changed and they transformed me as they were transforming the dissertation along the way. So I have a lot of appreciation for those small encounters that we had along the way. So I'm not sure if that even gets at an answer to your question, but that's just the ramblings of a mad dissertation writer.
Let me break.
Go ahead.
Let me break in. I forgot to invite the audience to ask questions and make comments on the chat feature of this. I'll watch that, and we'll bring your thoughts into this conversation as well.
Yeah, I thought it was a sort of madness that was involved, because it wasn't a normal thing to do, in terms of investigating something that it wasn't linear, which for me is always a good sign.
Well, and I won't lie.
I always take it as a good indication that a real exchange can happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was one of the challenges I had when I was writing about your stuff. Because you asked me a question of how many years from initial to completion, like how long did this take me? Probably a lot longer than it should have, a lot longer than my wife wanted it to. But from the time that I submitted my proposal and that was approved to the time when I defended the dissertation, it was 6.5 years. And one of the things that took me so long was the kind of the non-linearity of your work, its unruly nature. I was like, how do I represent this in text? That's something I still struggle with as I'm now trying to take this dissertation and I'm trying to break it so that I can share it in kind of a different form now that the dissertation has served its purpose. I'm trying to make it live beyond that. So yeah, it's that non-linearity, the unruly nature it presented a challenge, but it was also, I call it in my dissertation, I call it both a problem and a promise.
I'd like to emphasize the dissertation aspect. Listen to this title and think of it something you would like to read. On the problem and promise of Alex Caldiero's Sinosphere, doing dialogical co-performative ethnography, semicolon, or enter the poetarium. I mean, Tyler, nobody's ever going to read that. So you got to get a new title.
I know.
On the other hand, enter the poetarium, I thought, well, I didn't even quite understand that. That welcomed me in. And while the two of you are talking about the embrace and about the that thing that happens between two people when they're working on a similar project, and especially when it's nonlinear, you say in your dissertation, I'm not going to call it dissertation ever again. This is more than a dissertation. This is a really important text. Tyler, you say in your text that you are pursuing a relationship rather than studying a subject. And that's what you guys have been talking about. And then you also say, these are vulnerable observations. So you're not this objective jerk out there telling what Alex Caldiero's work means. You're pursuing a relationship and you're making vulnerable observations. So that's a whole bunch of things. Would any of it be interesting for either one of you to talk about?
Yeah, that's why I appreciated your response to my question and my interest. You know, that you took it, that it wasn't simply, that I wasn't simply a subject or an object.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm as deeply touched by this whole process as you are. Um, Especially when there's so much self-reflection and self-learning on my part. You know, you can't ask for more than from a relationship, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that was one thing I really responded to was the way that you are reflecting on yourself and putting yourself out there in your work. I was like, there were moments where I was like, just get this done, just write it, just get it down. But then there were other moments, and these kind of won out that I thought I can't do that because it's not giving Alex's work its due. It's not treating him and his life and his experience in the way that I would like my life and my experience to be treated if someone were writing about me. I didn't want to just impose on it. I wanted to walk side by side with it, to be with your work, instead of just for myself. So it was that vulnerability along the way. I felt that, and it changed me in ways just beyond you'll find in how long is that non-dissertation, Scott? You've got the PDF pulled up there. It's like the full thing's almost 400 pages.
Yeah.
So it changed me beyond just those. I mean, that's a lot for a dissertation. And other people in my program, they wrote like 200 pages and they were done. But mine just kept growing and growing, like I think your work does. And there was stuff that I cut out and didn't include, but I was changed beyond that. So
I bet none of your fellow graduate students writing their dissertations started a chapter with a sentence like, Grandpa Chadwick comes to my mind often. What's going on there, Tyler?
that was in that chapter. I write about an experience I had with my grandpa Chadwick, who passed away right after I'd started my doctoral work, and he'd been kind of this looming presence in my mind anyway. He was one of the reasons. My response to his dying was one of the reasons that I started writing poetry myself. And so he was there, but not there at the beginning of this whole process of getting my PhD. And I kept coming back to the idea of, in that chapter especially, thinking about my relationship with my grandpa and how he was a botanist and thinking about growing things his entire life, and kind of the unfolding, unruly nature of like tending a garden or tending the earth. It seemed to be in parallel to what Sinosphere does, kind of that you're tending to these ideas, that the spota that springs from experience, from the ground of being, and unfolds in our lives. And so to start off with that personal moment was kind of a way of trying to pull those threads together, but also to unravel them at the same time. Which is, I think, what this whole process did for me. Pulled it together and unraveled everything at the same time.
There's another section dealing with bread. And Alex, I wonder if you could talk to us about bread, and then Tyler, you talk about your grandma's bread.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that was one of the sections that, for obvious reasons, will always be dearest to me. That exchange that I had with your work, because within that image of bread, for me, there's an entire world. That unfortunately most of that world is gone from out here. And it almost exists as an icon, bread. that beyond the obvious connections with nurturing and with elemental, the staff of life and all of that, there's something totally unspeakable about bread, and our connection to it. And it's always, I connected with my grandmother especially,
Mm-hmm.
And reading that section, it was very affirming of what I always felt, and because to tell you the truth, when you think you're into some so solipsistic world that's so self-referential that you never really talk about it that much to anybody, and then all of a sudden there's a reference out there that makes sense, and it pulls you out of your own loneliness and your own isolation into a bigger world. And that's what reading that section did for me. Yeah, it was wonderful.
Oh, good.
And it sort of validated also some of the other things you were saying. See, it kind of threw light on many other things. It wasn't something just those two things,
Yeah.
And yeah, very valuable.
Well, for anybody who hasn't read my dissertation, I mean, why haven't you read it yet? But in this section, I was thinking about an experience I had with my grandma, like I just talked about my grandpa Chadwick. I was thinking about my grandma Chadwick too, who was, she's gone now, but then she was not well. And I was thinking about her bread recipe, how she used to make bread, cinnamon rolls for us every Holy Saturday when we were there at her house for the family Easter party. And the house just smelled of bread. And I tied that to, like you're talking about, Alex, this sense of nurturing, but it's also a lot more than that, because bread is so tied to who we are as a species. So I was thinking about those moments and the way that one of the things that she gave my wife and I for our wedding was her bread recipe, which I still have. I still refer to it, making that, but tying that to the nature of language, the way that we share language with one another, and your notion that Sinosphere is an exploration of language as communion, as a system that feeds us and nurtures us, sustains us, just like bread does, and that we should take the same care with language that we take with bread. So there's that kind of connection that was there in my mind and kind of spreading outward, just like bread does when it rises, rising into my consciousness, and then tying it to your the poem, the little narrative you have, the single solitary loaf of bread that your grandma put out on the table, and you performed that yesterday. It was kind of, or the day before, I don't remember which one.
It was yesterday.
Yeah, but it was those connections like you're talking about that. So it touched something in me and called forth this association with my own grandma's bread, and then it rose into something, a consideration beyond that. So the personal then, if I want to think about this in terms of a broader principle for why the humanities matter, which I think this whole week has been an experience of why the humanities should matter, why poetry matters, is that it moves from the personal and rises to the communal. The things that we put out on the table, they should feed other people as well. It's not just for us or not just for me or for you. Language is for us, it's for everybody. And so the things that we put out on our shared tables should nourish and sustain everyone, I think. And that's what your work has done for me, what poetry does for me more broadly, what literature does for me. So a lot bound up in that, I think.
It's also for me what teaching does for me.
Mm.
And Tyler, you write really movingly about how exploring Alex's work made a difference to your teaching. You also referenced several times a class that Alex and I taught together based on a line from a Hölderlin poem, Language Most Dangerous of Possessions. And it turns out Torben Bernhardt and Travis Lowe were both in that class. And we learned a lot from them. It was just a marvelous experience, that interaction that goes on in a class.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in what you both might say about connections between your poetry and your scholarship and your anything else tied to your teaching. What happens in a classroom?
Go ahead, Tyler.
Oh, this is something I've actually been thinking a lot about lately. And the questions, it keeps coming back to me of how does what I do as a poet and a rhetorician, how should that translate into the classroom, and responding to, as I see it, kind of these violent strains out into the world of, you got disinformation and bigotry and prejudice. How do I respond to those things in the classroom? And how do I ground my teaching in some kind of morality, in expanding moral literacy? And Alex's work was one thing in a lot of ways. It's got me thinking about that, and outside of that, and being critical of typical notions of pedagogy. And so, and that's one thing, it's been on my mind a lot lately, actually, especially the past several months. But I've always trying to create conditions in the classroom where students feel like they can share part of themselves, where they can put themselves out there and not have to hide behind this mask of objectivity and, oh, I have to keep my heart out of the classroom. I want them thinking with both their heads and their hearts about the work that we're exploring together. So I think that's really what interpretation should be. Oftentimes, and I was thinking about this morning, actually, Billy Collins has a poem called Introduction to Poetry. And I share this with my students every now and then. Just read it really quick. He says, I ask them, it's called Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So that's an approach to reading that really does violence to a text. It's tearing it apart. It's wresting it. It's twisting it. It's turning it to fit some idea of what I think it should mean, instead of letting it affect us on a human level. How does it make me feel? How do I respond to this? And that's one thing that I think, being in Alex's presence when he's performing, that I haven't been able to deny, is that sense that language is bodily, it's physical. It's like you were talking about the other day, it's the body is body, and then the body, all of those things tied up in each other. And I can't get away from that now. And I try to welcome my students into that way of thinking. It's not just what you think up here. It's how does this poem, what effect does it have on you? And so a specific thing I've done in my teaching is I have a unit in my English 1010 class where we look at language and performance, and I make my students perform a poem, but I also walk them through some really strange stuff to begin with. I move them away from language that's familiar into the Dada-esque, the nonsensical, and then we come back again and think about, okay, what happened along the way, and how do you feel different now than you did before we started this process? And a lot of that has its roots in the thinking I did about teaching because of my dissertation, which was, I mean, my PhD was in English and the teaching of English. So that was one of the requirements was, okay, how do you take your scholarship into the classroom and make it meaningful there?
Yeah, that's for me, the pedagogical approach is more like at the very beginning, and this is only applies with some of the upper division courses that I design, and not the more, the 1010, the 2020. But some of the other ones, like the one I'm teaching now on outsider arts or on John Cage or any of those, I start really by saying, what do I want to know? What do I would love to find out about? And that kicks off my research. I begin to kind of look around. I really, for instance, I did a course on the relationship between myth and religion, and beginning to view myth as an essential part of religion and not as a negative thing. That myth, the idea of myth as something just made up, or something, that's stories, but an actual mental exploration to find out those things that are the deepest questions that there are. Where did I come from? Where am I going? The myths were always about that. So I said, well, how does it work out? And then my research begins to kind of find this material, and I begin to kind of weld it together into a course. And those for me has been the most satisfying courses, because it was so engaging of an inner need that I was having, a real thing that was, stimulating my own curiosity. Unfortunately, sometimes nobody else wants to know that either, or only 10 people want to know, or only 4 people want to know, or, and so, there's been a couple of times when I've had to, beg to let a course go through because it was 9 people and we needed 11, and things like that, and dealing with that. But for me, it's always been, there's something, I have an investment in trying to learn something. And it's wonderful when it resonates with others. I remember the John Cage course. Holy cow, it was great. Anyway, so that kind of, so it becomes very personal, for me, this thing called teaching and learning, and the way they interface with each other in a very, very real way.
That teaching and learning and creating, that's like a really interesting trio.
Yeah.
I was talking on the phone with a friend of mine last night who asked me, why haven't you retired yet? It was Larry Harper, Alex. And I said, I love that circle that goes around and round, where I'm writing and thinking, and then I can go into a classroom, and then I can talk with other people and teach and learn, and it comes back around to my writing, and it goes around and round. I'd like to, before we end, I'd like to have the two of you talk about the Poetry is Wanted Here poem. It's the 9/11, we get the Twin Towers come down. Both of you respond in your work, I think, in really interesting ways. Alex, you wrote the letter poem to your friend Bob Heeman, and Tyler, you connected Alex's poem and your work on Alex's poem to your own life. So
Go ahead, Tyler. I'd be interested in hearing it again. Because didn't you write it somewhere? Because I read about it, and it was
Yeah.
really, really. I wouldn't mind revisiting it in my own head.
What, the poem or my
Your
reflection on your poem?
your interpretation and your approach to the poem.
Oh yeah. It was about, so my sister, in that moment, I was at Utah State. That's where I started before I moved to Weber State after 2 years. Um, but it was on 9/11. I woke up that morning, listened to it on the radio, um, and I wasn't like super affected by it. I had so much going on in my mind at that moment. Um, that I'd like to say the happenings of September 11th, 2011 changed me, that my grappling with the tragedy and its aftermath awakened my social consciousness and brought me to a greater understanding of my place in the world and my obligation to others. The most I could admit, though, is that the day's events unsettled me. So I take that moment and I think about it in conjunction with your poem, and then kind of bring in my sister's response to it, because she was kind of really devastated and scared because of what happened. And at first I didn't understand why she was responding that way. And it was only in thinking about your poem and that calling to mind her experience that it invited me into empathizing with her and recognizing the challenges that she was going through in that moment. And then kind of all of that working together to deepen my sense of who am I as a brother and as a human being, and as a citizen of this country, and what the hell, why does poetry even matter in this moment, and then the moments in the 20 years thereafter. So the poem became then a springboard again to, like a lot of your work has done for me in the dissertation and beyond, as a springboard into rethinking and reconsidering my relationship with other people. So I'll send you a copy of that again.
Yeah, do. For me, it was a literal, worrying about my buddy, and he worked downtown. He was on his way to work in the same building, pretty much, the World Trade Center. And so he got the subway stopped underneath when they blew up, and he didn't make it all the way to work. Had to walk back to the Brooklyn Bridge backward. And so it was a very personal kind of impact that it had. And I hadn't even considered the political, the terrorist attack or anything like that. It was basically like a personal attack on somebody that I knew. And so it had that resonance, because it's not every day that I respond. What is it? An occasional poem? What do they call those poems when you write for a specific occasion? It's a very rare thing that I do. And so there it was. I think there's a minimum of editing, literally.
Yeah, and I think it still holds a lot of resonance. Like I mentioned to you the other day, I'd return to it because it's become kind of one of those touchstone poems for me. I was listening to one of your readings of it, and just it really struck me, those moments of like encountering terrorism and fear and everything that's happening at home and bubbling up from underneath, and your response was a poem, was poetry. Poetry is wanted here. We need it. It feeds us. And I think there's something about that yeah, it's an occasional poem, but it works for, I think, every occasion.
Yeah, good.
We have a question from a listener, and it happens to be a very special listener, Travis Lowe. So Travis and Torben did that film, The Sinosphere. You can see that entire film. There's a link to it on the documentary tab of our website. It's a truly remarkable film. When I'm leading into the question. When Travis and Torben presented that film at Ken Sanders Rare Books, Tyler Chadwick was in the audience, as was I, and it was hotter than hell. And they turned off the fans so there wouldn't be that sound. And in his text, Tyler describes that evening in such a rich, bodily way while transcribing what's going on as Alex performs, and as an ambulance is going by outside, and as two women standing next to him have perfume that he can smell. It's just a rich, personal, bodily response. And he's taking notes in his notebook. And I found a notebook where I took some notes on Alex's performance. It's hard. How do you notate that? How do you bring away something you can use? And so Travis asks now finally to his question, Tyler, could you talk about your process of transcribing Alex's live and recorded performance? Did you learn that from ethnographic traditions?
Answer the second question first. Yes, I did learn it from ethnographic traditions, especially ethnopoetics, which was, it kind of grows out of the 1960s. Jerome Rothenberg is one in that tradition, and a couple others who are working with this idea of trying to transcribe something as it occurs or as it happens, so that you can have it on the page, because then they didn't have great recording equipment. They didn't have cell phones. You could just record it, show it to people. But transcribing them, for me, it was an act of close listening. To Travis's question, the process always began with listening to what was being said first. Okay, so what are the words here? And then after that, it's breaking it up into the different sections. Where does the performer, where does Alex pause? For how long does he pause? And then after that, and then trying to figure out ways of representing that on the page. And then after that, you get the words and the pauses, and then thinking about, okay, where does he go louder? Where's softer? Where do the words run together? Where is there a whisper or a rasp? And so the challenge with that, I mean, transcribing, say, that the one that you mentioned, Scott, that performance, which was about maybe not that long, the section that I transcribed, maybe 20 seconds, it takes hours. So sitting with something for that long, it can get really tedious, but it also, as an act of close listening, it compelled me, it forced me to really sit with the performance and what was happening in those moments, and to remember, if I was there, what was happening. And it really evoked a lot of that as I was working through that section as well. Yeah, but Travis, the challenge was definitely in working through that process, and then how does this add value to what I'm trying to say? How am I trying to represent this performance on its own terms, is what I call it. What worth is there in that? And for me, it forced me to listen really closely, which is something we all should practice a lot more.
Alex, we have about a minute. So why don't you take us out?
What do you mean take you out?
Don't get literal.
No, I've appreciated that approach, because I do a sort of similar thing when I first, the idea of a score, sort of is reflective and connected to that, so that when I'm reading it, I do, for me, the differences between lines makes a big deal. The kind of punctuation that I use is not really grammatical, but it's more notational. The period, the comma, the breaking up of a line, so that's my own version, which we've all learned from Mallarmé, Un Coup de Day, which is one of the premier works that uses that notation. And then it was carried on by the futurists, the size of words, as far as volume is concerned. So I have, as a poet, I have my own version of it. Jerome Rothenberg, for instance, has an incredible transcription. What is it? The Songs of Johnny John. What is it? The American Indian, where he transcribes and uses the tools he learned from concrete poetry and from futurist poetry in order to notate an ethnographical phenomenon of an American Indian song, and trying to re-represent it on the page. And so, it's very, very important to the way I approach a page, very much so.
So we have to bring this to a close. It's the end of our time. Tyler Chadwick, I've learned a lot from this conversation. Thank you very much. And Alex Caldiero, thank you again, as always.
Thank you.
And thank you. And you're welcome.